afternoon, everyone. It has just gone 12:30, so I will make a start. My name's Rachel Russell, and I'll just explain a little bit more about my role, but hopefully you are all here this afternoon to hear the special webinar that we're doing at Foundations for OT Week. So hopefully the majority of you are occupational therapists, and that's why you're here this afternoon. So we're doing this special webinar because I just want to take the opportunity to explore with you this afternoon, just looking at how perhaps our current ways of working across health, social care, and those silos of practice that we sometimes have might impede older and disabled people's opportunity to get adaptation. So the webinar this afternoon is just really a kind of a thought piece around how we can look at current policy that is out there and opportunities to provide ease of access for people to access adaptations. There is a chat box, so if people have questions, I'm probably not going to be able to answer those questions as I go along. I'm going to struggle to multitask, but I will obviously at the end I'll go back through any chat there is and see if there's any questions out there. So yeah, so just a warm welcome. I'm assuming that most of you know who Foundations are, but I am aware that there might be a number of occupational therapists here this afternoon that perhaps aren't aware of Foundations, or perhaps if you are aware of Foundations, you perhaps don't fully understand our role. So just really quickly, on behalf of the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities, Foundations is the national advisory body for the Disabled Facilities Grant and for home improvement agencies, and that includes local authority adaptations team. So as an organisation, we are here to support the sector that are involved in obviously the Disabled Facilities Grant, which obviously includes occupational therapists, but we also support home improvement agencies and, as I say, adaptation services. Our role is to work with local authorities to ensure that you're doing what you can do in terms of providing the DFG and supporting home improvement agencies as well. So we have 5 regional advisors that provide practitioners with support. We work with operational managers and strategic leaders within local authorities as well to look at current delivery and hopefully improve the delivery of the Disabled Facilities Grant, as well as the fantastic things that Home Improvement Agency and Adaptation Service does. So that's what we do at Foundations. In terms of my role, so I am the Senior Regional Advisor, so I take a little bit of a leadership role of the regional advisors, but as all the regional advisors, we've all got an area of expertise. So my colleague Dave, who covers London and South East at the moment, he was previously Home Improvement Agency Manager. And my area of expertise is assessment and social care. So I am an occupational therapist. Now, I appreciate that I sit behind my lovely desk at Foundations, and you might be certainly when I start talking about some of the things around doing things differently, oh, sorry, let me just cancel that. Yeah, so when I start talking about some of the things that we could do differently as occupational therapists across health and social care, some of you might be kind of saying, oh, well, it's all right, Rachel saying that, but she doesn't know what it's like working in the real world. I do want to give some reassurance. I was a community occupational therapist for around 20 years. I did work for a short time in academia. And then just before joining Foundations, I was a principal occupational therapist as well. So I know what it's like to be a practitioner as well as a manager in social care as well. So as I say, I appreciate that I now sit behind my lovely desk at Foundations, but I do know what it's like out there in terms of the real world, as it were. So again, I appreciate that lots of you will understand what the Disabled Facilities Grant is, but I'm aware that perhaps some of you might have heard of it, but not fully understand what the grant is, or you might not have heard of the Disabled Facility Grant at all. So this slide is just a quick crash course in terms of the Disabled Facilities Grant. So the grant itself, it's a mandatory grant. So if somebody puts in a valid application, then the local authority has a statutory duty to provide a disabled facilities grant. The grant actually sits in housing legislation, and therefore every year the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities gives local authorities across England an allocation to provide these mandatory grants. So usually around about May time, your local authority will receive its allocation for disabled facilities grants from the Department of Levelling Up. Now, although it's a separate grant and it's there primarily to provide mandatory grants for adaptations through the Disabled Facilities Grant, since 2015, the pot of money for Disabled Facilities Grant has been part of your area's Better Care Fund. Okay, and again, the reason that the government took that decision to place it within the Better Care Fund in your area was obviously, as we all know, the Better Care Fund is around how we encourage systems to work in an integrated way to provide services and support for older and disabled people. Obviously, the Disabled Facilities Grant is providing adaptations, so it makes real sense in terms of it sitting within the Better Care Fund. It's really good that it sits in there because strategically we local authorities can ensure that the DFG, the Disabled Facilities Grant, is contributing to your area's Better Care Fund, and hopefully is contributing to the outcomes that you're trying to achieve through your Better Care Fund. The government is really committed to the Disabled Facilities Grant, really sees it as a valuable resource in terms of how we will support older and disabled people ageing in place, and has significantly increased the DFG pot of money over recent years. So back in 2015, when the DFG first went into the Better Care Fund, the DFG allocation from government was around, I think it was about 270 million. It now sits at over £500 million. And so that's this year and next year, and also the Department of Health and Social Care has added a further 102 million over the next 2 years. So as you can see, we've got 570 million for this year and 573 million for adaptations. There can be some discretionary use of the DFG allocation. So it can be used for mandatory grants, but where a local authority has a housing assistance policy, it allows them to have a little bit of discretion around how they use that pot of money. It can be used at times for other social care capital projects, but you still have to provide your mandatory grant, so that has to be a priority. And any use of the allocation for social care capital projects have to really strategically align to those outcomes that have been trying to achieve in your area through the Better Care Fund plan. Now, as occupational therapists, we have, or you as occupational therapists, have a significant role in the DFG process. And that's because in the primary legislation that the grant sits in two-tier authority, there has to be consultation with social care, helping and guiding housing to understand what works are required. So what are the necessary and appropriate cost-effective adaptations? And occupational therapists and social care are seen as kind of key professionals that have a role in helping housing understand what is what is the best way to use that adaptation, and what is necessary and appropriate. So that is why occupational therapists have a role within the DFG process. Doesn't always have to be an occupational therapist, and as we go through the presentation, I will kind of explore why it doesn't always necessarily need to be an occupational therapist. It was brilliant last year because we had government published new DFG guidance. So after this presentation, I will send a copy of the slides. So please don't feel free that you have to write copious amounts of notes, because I will send a copy of the slides, and I'll also send a link out with that email. Sorry, I've got things pinging through on me here. And I will send a link through to where you can download the DFG guidance. It's a really, I mean, obviously I work for Foundation, so I'm going to say this, but it is a really good document. It explores strategically how the DFG contributes to the system in terms of health and social care and supporting older and disabled people. And chapter 4 is for you guys as occupational therapists that are dealing with the DFG, would highly recommend have a read of chapter 4, because that talks about the process. So what does a good process in the DFG process look like? So I would highly recommend, if you're involved in the DFG, to have a read of chapter 4, because it talks about the role of social care. It talks around the role of assessors who look at assessing what's necessary and appropriate, as I say, which is usually the occupational therapist role. So just for those of you who might not know a great deal about the DFG, it's a fantastic resource, but it can only be used for certain purposes. So you can't just apply for a DFG for everything. One of the things as part of identifying whether somebody is entitled or eligible for a DFG is that what they're applying for has to meet one or more of these purposes, but they're quite broad purposes. So obviously OT week this week is focusing on occupations and the importance of those everyday activities we want, need and have to do. And what's great about the DFG is that for older and disabled people where their impairments and the design of the home is making life difficult for them to perform and carry out those everyday activities, the DFG is great because, as you can see, there's a number of purposes for which it can be used that improves that accessibility, improves what I call the person environment fit, so we can take away those, work with our housing colleagues, our technical officers and surveyors to design adaptation that remove those barriers. So as you can see here, the DFG can be used to provide adaptations and facilities that help the person get in and out of the property. It's about making the property safer, interestingly, for everybody that lives there. It's about providing access to those essential areas of the home where those everyday activities that have meaning and purpose take place. So the living room, the bedroom, the toilet. It's about providing access to a bath or a shower. Includes providing facilities to help that older person continue to prepare and cook food. It can also be used to improve or providing heating if that's required above and beyond the existing heating system. Can also again be used for adaptations that help that older person or disabled person control power, light and heating. Can also help a disabled person if they've got carer's responsibility. So those of you that work with younger disabled people that have perhaps got children, then again the DFG is brilliant because it can be used to provide that disabled person with access around their home to carry out those care duties and access to the garden. So it's brilliant is the DFG, because from an occupational therapy perspective and from an occupational performance and participation, we can work with our housing colleagues to support that person to apply for a DFG so that they can access these areas of the home so that they're able to carry out and perform those everyday activities that are important to them. I can't take any credit for this slide, and I put this slide in because obviously many of you probably are social care OTs that have two hats. You probably got the hat that you're wearing under the Care Act, where you're helping your local authority discharge its duties under the Care Act, so that preventative element where you're looking at how to prevent, reduce, delay older and disabled people developing health and social care, and you might also be looking at supporting a person in terms of meeting their eligible needs under the Care Act. So my fantastic colleague Anita Mottram, who is a principal occupational therapist in Kirklees, produced this slide, and what it's basically doing is, and again, for those of you that work in social care, you will be very familiar with the concept of asset-based approaches to meeting needs. And the DFG is a fantastic asset in which people can apply to actually meet their needs. So what you've got on the left-hand side are the wellbeing principles under the Care Act. And on the right-hand side, Anita's explored how the DFG potentially, if all the right conditions are met, somebody can apply for the DFG and use that to meet eligible need under the Care Act. So I really like that because it kind of shows the synergies that there are between the Care Act and how the DFG can be used to support people's needs. So the reason I'm doing this presentation and talking about silos of working, which will become clearer as in the next few slides, is, as I say, although in my role at Foundations, I think adaptations are that area where housing, the NHS, health, social care, sometimes education actually kind of come together. And I think I often feel that I've got a very privileged role because I've got that unique perspective around the issues that there are across those each of those areas. So the challenges that NHS OTs have got that work in hospitals and the pressure for discharge, the pressure for social care OTs, the pressure for OTs that work in health, work in reablement and community rehab teams. So often the issues that older and disabled people have, I've kind of got a bird's eye view as to why those issues often happen. And as I say, I think adaptations and the DFG process is a lovely example of how those different areas of, as I say, of housing, NHS, health and social care kind of converge. And so I guess the presentation is kind of some of those thoughts that I've had over the last 2 years working at Foundations around actually, is there a better way of managing those silos? So as I say, my role, I think I've got quite a unique perspective. So for occupational therapists, in terms of what is happening in the NHS, health and social care, I think it's really good news for occupational therapists because I think there's a recognition that our skills and knowledge are ideal in terms of dealing and supporting hospital discharge, keeping people at home, keeping people safe, warm and independent. And so the real good news is that the demand for occupational therapy resource across NHS, health, social care and housing is growing. And as we've got here, we've seen that, and for me, and I apologise for any hospital OTs here, but for me, I'm an occupational therapist. I'm interested in where people carry out those everyday activities, and the majority of activities we do undertake are often in people's homes. So for me, being a community OT and seeing that shift from hospital-based occupational therapy support and services out into the community is brilliant. Obviously, the Care Act has been around for now nearly 10 years, but again, the Care Act and the Children's Act, those pieces of social care legislation, that is one of the reasons why we have occupational therapists in social care, are brilliant bits of legislation because they look holistically at, and I know the words holistic tend to be get overused. But if you look at the Care Act, if you look at those wellbeing principles, it's those everyday activities that people want, need and have to do. And again, I think as occupational therapists, those pieces of legislation kind of almost align philosophically with how we think and view the world in terms of health and well-being. So again, you know, that's why we're employed in social care, because I think there is that recognition. We've obviously got policy changes, so we've got things like discharge to assess and urgent care response. And again, COVID has obviously accelerated some of those changes. So again, we're moving that assessment, and rightly so. An acute hospital ward isn't necessarily the right place to assess the long-term or medium to long-term needs of an older or disabled person. So discharge to assess an urgent care response. Let's keep people in their own homes. Let's assess people and look at how we address those needs in people's homes. And again, as occupational therapists, it's fantastic because we have got that skill and knowledge set that helps us as support our social care and health in terms of supporting to keep people at home. Again, we're moving and have been for a long time around that strength-based approach to assessment. So let's not focus on what you can't do, let's focus on what you can do. You know, what resources have you got available, and that asset-based approaches. And again, for occupational therapists, I think, you know, when we're allowed to practice in the way we should practice, we naturally assess and work with people in that strength-based approach. I think as occupational therapists, we're very good at being creative around what assets somebody might have available to them to meet their health and social care needs. You know, we don't immediately jump to a care package. We think about actually, because often people just need advice, or is it assistive technology, or is it X, Y, and Z to meet that individual's needs? And obviously we've got, goes without saying, we've got that aging population, which is something, you know, we should celebrate, but it does mean that we've got more and more people wanting to remain in their own home environment. And it's about, you know, we're needing the kind of workforce there to help and support those individuals who might need assessment. And also the complexity of people's situations as well. So obviously when I started practicing back in the early 90s, then, you know, it wasn't often we had complex cases, whereas now actually the majority of cases that we see coming through to the occupational therapy team are those complex cases, certainly from a social care perspective. The other two key documents I just want to kind of put in the picture now is obviously a couple of years ago, the government published the social care white paper, which was around people at the heart of care. And then in the last couple of months, very, very recently, we have had the new community rehab and reablement model and the intermediate care framework published. Now, initially, I had some anxiety because obviously the social care white paper is how we manage people's needs kind of medium to long term. And obviously the kind of intermediate care framework and reablement model is around how do we address that kind of 6-week need when people have been discharged from hospital. And I did initially have some anxieties that the two kind of approaches would have kind of not dovetailed, but they do. Just as a reminder for those that aren't familiar with what the key messages are from the social care reform white paper. And again, what is really fantastic news for OTs is that what's really a golden thread through that paper is that adaptations and assistive technology is going to be one of the key strategies that we are going to be using with older and disabled people to provide them with control and choice, help them to stay safe, warm and independent in their own home. And that's one of the key messages. So again, obviously, as a social care occupational therapist, a lot of the interventions and solutions that you provide are around adaptations and assistive technology. So again, that's a really a real opportunity for social care OTs. But what the government does make very clear is that adaptations and equipment will only provide older and disabled people with that control and choice if people have ease and quick access to the adaptations and assistive technology. Okay. And that there has to be that ease of access, because without it, we're not going to build that resilience, or older and disabled people aren't going to have the opportunity to build their resilience to age in place. So it's really important that we tackle any waiting list, because what we know is that the longer people wait for adaptations, the more likely that they're not going to be, once installed, they're not going to have the outcomes. So those are the key messages from the social care white paper. I did have some anxieties when the new framework came out, because what I was concerned about was what happens after the 6 weeks. What happens once, you know, we've worked with the older or disabled person, and, you know, we've provided that 6 weeks of input. But what was really positive in the framework was to see these 3 areas. One, it talked about the framework and systems working across the NHS health and social care to streamline processes and avoid handoff and duplications. And there's a lot that happens within the adaptations process, which I'll talk about shortly. The framework also talks about PAM professional development. Now, we'll all be familiar with PAM professional development and working, because we're all very used to kind of working with our physiotherapy colleagues, but as occupational therapists, we're very used to working with our OT colleagues that work in the hospital environment, the reablement environment, etc. So we're used to that PAM professional development. But in terms of the adaptations, and I'll explore this towards the end of the presentation, actually there's an opportunity in terms of providing ease of access, is actually working with our housing colleagues to provide that quick access to the assessment that leads to adaptations, as well as the provision of adaptations. So, you know, working with our technical officers and our surveyors who've got lots of knowledge around adaptation. So that opportunity to work PAM professional, which is in the new framework, was music to my ear. And also around coordinating specialist expertise. So there's real opportunities out there for us as occupational therapists, but there are also challenges that we face at the moment. So one of the kind of challenges that I've alluded to at the moment in terms of the adaptation process is that we have got occupational therapists that work in acute hospital settings, we've got OTs that work in hospital rehab teams, we've got occupational therapists that work separately in community rehab teams, we've got occupational therapists that work in reablement teams, we've got occupational therapists that work in social care, and we've also got, in some areas, occupational therapists that work in housing as well. Now, the traditional model of the way that services have been commissioned is that there's been no systems thinking really around actually what does the older person need in terms of getting access to the support and help that they need. What we've tended to do is we've commissioned occupational therapy resource based on the needs of the service. So social care will employ OTs because we've got the Care Act. The NHS will employ occupational therapy to support with discharge planning. And what happens is we've ended up in England and probably across the UK where there are lots of silos of practice. So what does this mean for social care? What has happened with silos of working, or what we need to think about is how we increase assessment capacity for adaptations. In terms of those silos of practice, what it can feel like for the older person that needs an adaptation is that they feel that their case is being handed on, kind of that passing the baton on. And I am aware, because obviously I work with 300 and odd local authorities, I am aware that in some areas a hospital OT will do their bit, refer it on and identify, we've tried bathing equipment pass it on to my community rehab colleague to see if they will do some bits and pieces. The community rehab team picks up that referral and does a little bit more of intervention. Actually, the hospital OT was right. Equipment's not going to work. Bath lift is not going to work. As a rehab OT in the NHS, I can't look at adaptations, and therefore I'm going to pass that on to my social care OT colleague. Okay, and in some areas the social care OT will deal with that. I am aware in some areas that with some types of adaptation that might then be handed over to a housing occupational therapist. So what does that feel like for the person? Well, the person just feels like we've already identified that bathing was an issue. We probably knew that equipment, because I'm in my 80s, I've got a Rockwood scale of X, I'm unlikely to achieve significant outcomes from a rehab. So what that feels to that older person is that their case just get handed on and on and on. And I will challenge you as occupational therapists, because one of the things that we celebrate as a profession is that we talk about we're person-centred. But actually, how person-centred is that approach to working? I've done my bit on the hospital. It's not my problem. It's now over to you in community rehab. I've done my community rehab bit. It's now over to you. Actually, how person-centred is that? So just kind of some food for thought there. What the data is also telling us as well, and I appreciate data, there is always nuanced factors that might be behind what the data is telling us. But when data was collected for the first time around the DFG, around who's accessing it, so back in 2009, around 70% of DFG grants were going to older people. Now, given that we've got an ageing population, we've got more older people remaining in their homes, etc., the percentage of older people now accessing the DFG has dropped. And what I suspect is happening is that older people with relatively simple needs, and we'll talk about what makes a case complex, I suspect it's those older people that are waiting for an assessment, because what we know is that social care is doing a fantastic job in terms of dealing with a lot of the complex stuff that's moving from hospital or community rehab teams. At the end of the day, the buck always stops with social care because of the Care Act legislation. So ultimately, social care and the occupational therapists working in social care can't ever kind of turn away referrals, because at the end of the day, they will probably have a statutory duty to assist. But it's about being aware that when you're handing over that case, because you're thinking we can hand it over to social care to pick up, actually it's going to probably be Mrs. What I always call the little Mrs. Russell, who's sat waiting on the waiting list. So why is this an issue? Because at the end of the day, if we're passing on that referral and it's finally getting to social care, then because social care are having to do all the complex stuff, all the urgent stuff, it is often people like Robert and Agatha who are the people that end up waiting for adaptations, because their needs are what we call relatively simple. There's that risk assessment that often it's people like Robert and Agatha that, yes, it's not ideal, but often there's less risk of them waiting for assessment than perhaps somebody with more complex needs, where if we don't do anything, there might be a hospital readmission, or we're trying to get somebody out of hospital. So when you're passing the baton over, it's just about thinking it is people like Robert and Agatha that usually end up waiting a significant amount of time for adaptations. Why is this an issue? Well, it's an issue because what we know is that the longer people wait for adaptations, they often require more complex adaptations or more costly adaptations, because their confidence and their kind of occupational performance has declined whilst they've been waiting. Even where an adaptation is required, often what that will then require is often an adaptation with a care package as well, or often where a care package has gone in to support that individual whilst we wait for adaptation. What is then really difficult to do is kind of withdrawing that care package. And it's just the other unintended consequences, because obviously for Robert and Agatha, obviously the reason that they need an adaptation is to improve that person-environment fit. And obviously the longer that they wait, there might be adverse consequences such as falls, etc., etc. So as we're passing the baton on over with these types of cases, it's about thinking actually the real impact. And as you can see here, these are our foundations personas, but they are based on real world case studies. We've kind of pulled together various aspects of cases to develop our personas. And, you know, some people can wait more than 10 months for an assessment that leads eventually to a DFG. So at the moment, in terms of our silos of working, and I appreciate in terms of commissioning, for many of you that are just practitioners, some of that commissioning will be out of your hands, but what isn't out of your hands is how you want to work as an occupational therapist. And it's just about being aware that in terms of that passing the baton, at the moment, the assessment capacity in social care, and particularly for occupational therapy, is so stretched. And as I say, it's always very difficult for social care because everything stops at that door because there is nowhere else for that individual to go. So we need to, although it's a challenge in terms of how do we increase that capacity, it's a real opportunity for us as occupational therapists to think, actually, as a collective profession, is there something that we can be doing that's different? So I think that given what is in the intermediate care framework in terms of that PAM professional working, looking at system working, looking at how we avoid handovers, I think there's a real opportunity because we are all occupational therapists. And this last part of the presentation is what I want to explore. So as I say, remember what the intermediate care framework and rehab model talked about. It's about streamlining processes. So, you know, how we avoid handoffs and duplication, that PAM professional working and coordinating specialist expertise. So let me explore those with you. Now, my job, one of my jobs at Foundations is to challenge you here this afternoon with some of the things that I am changing. And one of the things I get accused a lot of, because I do kind of challenge current ways of working and is the way of doing it, is that I'm often accused of what I'm suggesting is about letting go of what is important to us, as occupational therapists. Those who might know me hopefully know that I am really passionate, and hopefully it's coming across this afternoon, in terms of the role of occupational therapists. I think because occupation is the heart of what we do, you know, I think in terms of the interventions that we provide, I think we make a real impact in terms of health and well-being. So these next few slides isn't about letting go of what is important to us as a profession, as occupational therapists, but it is about needing to think differently about how we hold those things. Thinking about, actually, could we avoid some of this handing the baton on? So actually, as a group of professionals across a place, across a local authority, actually, could we, although we might not be working all the way through with that individual, is there a way that we could work closer together, drop some of those boundaries? So actually, as a professional group across the system, actually we're being much more person-centred. So it's thinking differently about how we hold them. And if we think differently, we can then start influencing that workforce development that will be taking place as your local authority in your area starts thinking about how they embed the new intermediate care model, how it embeds the recommendations from the social care white paper. So it's about us not being threatened by that change, but us thinking about, actually, how do we look at this collectively as a group of occupational therapists across our area so that we avoid that handoff and duplication. So in terms of streamlining, sometimes it is about understanding the kind of customer journey. Actually, what is the journey the person goes through to get an adaptation, and how can we therefore avoid duplication? So kind of, as I said, I've just put this here, just kind of reminding at the moment, we've got those silos of practice. I've taken this from Anne Turner, and I'm sorry if it's coming up really small on the screen, but this is some work that Anne Turner, and again, I'll put the reference in the email that I send out later. But I really like this because this is basically what we have in common, all occupational therapists. So I don't know who we've got here this afternoon, but we might have some NHS OTs that work in hospitals. Hopefully we might have some housing, we might have some social care OTs. What we have all in common is our central kind of philosophy. We all believe that doing the everyday activities, and this is what OT Week is about, isn't it? Doing those everyday activities that we have to, need to, want to do is how people maintain their health and well-being. We all share that, whether you're a mental health OT, whether you're an OT working in an acute NHS A&E department, we all share that belief. In terms of our core reasoning skills, we all use the same core reasoning skills. So when we're assessing somebody, we're interested in what is it that is important to that person in terms of their occupational needs. We're there identifying actually what those everyday activities that we need to work on, what is stopping you doing those everyday activities. As all OTs, we all do that when we're doing that assessment and we're kind of coming up with the goals. We are all wanting to facilitate people's ability to participate in those everyday activities. And we then all evaluate the impact that we've got. Now, the bit that differs potentially is how we improve, how we facilitate that improvement in occupational performance. And that's because at the bottom here, we've got all the different bits and pieces, those practice skills that we use with people. So it could be, if we've got anybody from wheelchair service use, you're using wheelchair assessments to provide adaptation, wheelchairs to help people's independence. It could be you're doing home visits to look at what the barriers are at home. So that's the bit that often differs, and it's about that opportunity to think about, actually, is there other bits and pieces that, as I appreciate, it's not about creating more work, but it is about thinking, actually, some of this, if it's an adaptation, actually, if it's relatively simple, is it something that I could do as a hospital OT if the needs aren't going to change significantly? So it's just about looking at what we've all got in common. So I'll just go through this really quickly. I was down in the southeast last week, and there was a group of occupational therapists across the system there. So we had NHS OTs, mental health OTs, physical OTs, and I got them, and there was about 100 and odd OTs, absolutely brilliant session. And I got them all to shout out, if you were the OT doing an assessment, what do you see? And as I say, we had a mixed group of OTs all working in their little silos, but they all were able to observe and say, you know, what they were seeing and how this bathroom is used in every day. So they were able to say, well, you know, as an OT, I can see, you know, there's leisure activities going on in that bathroom, you know, obviously personal care tasks, you know, it's obviously, you know, an area that's being used for play and also child development. Obviously, somebody's got to clean the bathroom, you know, it's, you know, bathrooms are a really important place in terms of, you know, our rituals and habits, and also how we use the bathroom is really influenced by our culture. Now, it wasn't just social care OTs that were able to identify, all the OTs, whether from mental health, whether from an acute hospital setting, they were all, and for me that was really reassuring, because it's that recognition that as all OTs, yes, we might be working in different settings, but we're all seeing the same thing in terms of how we as individuals use our home, and the older and disabled people that we're working with, how they use their home. Just really quickly, I'll go through these quickly because I'm mindful of time, but I am, obviously, having worked in academia, I am into my models and visualizing theoretically what we're doing. But it's just this idea that obviously as occupational therapists, what we're often doing is working with an individual in their home environment where there's a good fit between them and that idea that it supports their occupational performance and participation. But then we're working with individuals, and this is often whether somebody's been admitted into an acute setting or referred to social care, Often it's because that home environment, for whatever reason, isn't supporting that individual and they can't cope in that home environment. Obviously, our primary care colleagues are looking at kind of what they can do through medication, rehab, or very specialist kind of person-centered rehab, or neural, kind of operations, that kind of stuff. But for those of us that work in health and social care and housing, what we're doing is we're not trying to change Mrs. Russell, but we're trying to look at actually how do we create a more supportive environment, because often, even with rehab, we can't get Mrs. Russell back to where she was before. So what we need to do is actually look at how we create a better fit between Mrs. Russell through advice, equipment, assistive technology, adaptations. And that's what we're doing. And any OT should be able to kind of, to a certain extent, look at how they do that. And as I said, I'll just quickly go through these, but from a rehab, because I think, again, I got very frustrated as in social care, because I think often we're not seen as part of that rehab, or we don't contribute to the rehab process because we're just about sorting out the environment. And that's not the case. Obviously, we can do reablement rehab to the person, but there's a lot that we can do in terms of rehabbing and reabling the environment to support people. So this is just a reminder in terms of how equipment and adaptation supports people's health and well-being. So adaptations and equipment can enhance the person's capabilities. So from a motor, sensory, cognitive and communication perspective. So if we've got somebody with rheumatoid arthritis who doesn't have fine motor control, it's how we can use things like lever taps to use the bit of movement that the person has and enhance their capabilities. Often we struggle to do everyday activities because of the demand of the environment. So, if you're working with somebody with dementia who might be really sensitive to noise and that might be causing behaviours of concern, then is there stuff that we can do to make the environment less challenging for that person with dementia? So can we look at soundproofing? Can we look at, the patterns of the carpet and the walls that might be causing that distress? So lots that we can do in terms of rehab and reablement, in terms of reducing the demands of the environment. And again, about reducing the demands of the task itself and kind of working with carers to reduce carer strains. So things like, if a family are really struggling with a mobile hoist, can we look at ceiling track hoist? So loads of ways that it's not just about sticking in equipment. Actually, the equipment and adaptation and the use of the DFG, the Disabled Facilities Grant, is contributing significantly to that rehab and reablement approach. So how can we then practically do less of this passing the referral on, passing the baton on, so that we can be more person-centred? A shout out to the Royal College of Occupational Therapists, because they began to address this back in 2019 with the publication of Adaptations Without Delay. I have to declare some interest in this, because alongside the Housing Lane and Marnie Walker, who's another fantastic housing occupational therapist, I was part of the team that were involved in this. And it's about that proportionate assessment, that you don't always need a very specialist social care OT, because a social care OT is a very specialist area of OT. And with more simple adaptations, you don't necessarily need to be using that specialist resource on those simple adaptations. And it's a reminder of, is a grab rail a simple or complex adaptation? Hopefully, you'll all be now saying, well, actually, it depends. And it does depend. Actually, a grab rail can be, yes, it's a simple, straightforward solution in terms of, its construction, but it can be a solution to a really complex situation. And obviously, what makes the situation complex is that person and what their priorities are. It's actually the nature of the occupation that they're carrying out. Is it a simple activity? So the activity analysis, is it a simple activity? Or is it really complex, where it's involving a number of people to support that person to complete that activity? It can be complex, not just because it's you know, the environment's physically challenging, but often it can be the social environment that makes a case complex. That yes, the house looks fairly easy to adapt, but actually because of the social situation, and that often can make it complex. And again, it does depend on the type of solution. So I live in West Yorkshire, I live in Bradford, I live in Haworth, which is where the Bronte sisters are from, and my drive is a 1 in 4. And so as I age in place and I struggle to get up and down the drive, I can tell you, I appreciate I'm an occupational therapist, but you know, I'm an older person who is quite competent, and I will be able to tell you that I can't get up and down my drive. I don't need an occupational therapist coming in to assess me, to agree with me that I'm struggling to get up and down the drive. What I need to do is actually probably work with the technical officer and surveyor to find what the most appropriate solution is. So it's just about thinking around proportionality and thinking around, actually, as a community rehab OT, if I'm just asking, if I've identified that I can't do equipment with this individual, actually, is it something that if I work with my social care colleagues and we put the right systems in place, could it be something that I can refer directly for a DFG? So what I want teams and systems to start thinking about is that adaptations journey, thinking about the adaptations journey for those relatively non-complex situations, the Mrs. Russells who've got 1 to 2 comorbidities, who are naturally aging in place, and that actually how we can support more occupational therapists within the NHS and both in hospital and community settings, making more recommendations for simple DFG types of work. And as I say, this is just a bit of advertisement, I guess, for us at Foundations, that when I joined Foundations last year, or 2 years ago now, we did some work around looking at what requires a specialist occupational therapist in social care to be involved with, and actually what could we be doing differently in terms of the more simpler cases. And again, the new DFG guidance that I mentioned that was published last year very much supports that approach. Where it's a relatively simple DFG, then let's look at a more trusted assessor approach rather than using that precious social care occupational therapy resource that needs to be used with more complex cases. So this is just about handing everything over and just expecting it now every NHS hospital OT. I'm not saying that, but it's just that reminder that we don't rehab or re-able people in isolation of their home environment. So for all occupational therapists, I passionately believe the impact of the home environment should be part of all our areas of interest when we're working with people. And it's just that reminder that when we're rehabbing or re-abling somebody, so that sounds a clunky way of putting it, but we're not, you know, and we're using equipment and adaptations, and particularly adaptations, what we need to remember is that as occupational therapists, it's not us. Yes, we'll contribute to the design sometimes of adaptations, but we're using design and construction methods to improve that fit between the person and their environment. But we can't do that on our own. We have to work with technical officers and surveyors, and they can really help us to do that. And it's about thinking, how can we do some of that without necessarily having to hand it over to a social care OT? Now, in Northern Ireland, their health and social care system is more joined up as it here, but they've developed the housing adaptation design toolkits where they've got proformas of various designs. So it's about thinking creatively. Can we put some of those things in place, working with our technical officers and surveyor colleagues, that mean that perhaps we can extend the range of people that identify what's necessary and appropriate, and then pass that on to our technical officers that can then design the adaptation. And I think it's designing the adaptation process around that customer journey. So kind of thinking, actually, what does that older person need? Actually, they just need that one kind of assessment, and then they need to be passed on to the adaptations team, who can then carry out the adaptations rather than going through a series of adaptations. So if I have kind of pricked people's interest in terms of, actually, could this be something we look at in our area? Then again, this is taken out of adaptations without delay, and this is for targeted. So these are the cases, the Mrs. Russells, who's got a couple of comorbidities, doesn't need the specialist assessment skills of a social care OT. This is, so these are these types of cases. So, and I think for a lot of health and community rehab OTs, I think you've probably got these skills here. It's just formalising and making sure that you've got the right governance mechanisms in place. So if you want to start, what do you need to do to start thinking about working differently? It is about, as an area, it's about sitting and looking as a group of occupational therapists that are currently working perhaps across all those silos, and thinking about, actually, what are the skills and knowledge that we've all got in common. You know, how could we develop some resources and tools where we're not putting additional workload on the NHS hospital OTs and the reablement and the rehab OTs, but could we develop some really simple resources and tools that would mean that we can capture the professional reasoning around the need for an adaptation and the need for a DFG, and then pass that through to the people that actually deal with the adaptation and the disabled facilities grant, which is your local authority adaptations team or the home improvement agency. So what could you be doing as a community OTs in your areas where you are currently working in those silos of practice, to actually say, how do we work much better in a person-centred way for the individuals? Again, making sure that you put in place those governance mechanisms to keep you safe as practitioners and working in a different way, and to support that kind of trusted assessor model. And as I say, you know, things like the housing adaptations toolkit that they have in Northern Ireland, that is their way of looking at, actually, this is a great resource that will help extend the range of OTs that can recommend adaptations, so that we don't build in any unnecessary weights. And it's also about recognising that in terms of the disabled facilities grant, and you might not want to hear this, but you as occupational therapists, actually, in terms of the DFG process, only play a relatively small part in that person getting an adaptation. Don't get me wrong, you play an important part, because often you are the person that's identifying that an adaptation and a DFG application is going to meet that person's need and keep that person independent. And you're often that person that's identifying what type of adaptation is necessary and appropriate. But you are only one small part. There are a number of other professionals within the adaptations team and home improvement agency who are just as skilled as occupational therapists, obviously in different ways, that can actually still support that adaptation process, and that they do it in a way that provides really good outcomes. And again, it's about exploring, hopefully for the social care OTs and the housing OTs, you've already got hopefully really good relationships and are doing this already. But it is about looking at that opportunity to say, right, actually, some of this, can we do it differently so that we can get those referrals down to you quickly? And it's just about, as I say, I appreciate I've spoken about a lot this afternoon, and we're coming up to 1:30, so I've been speaking for an hour. But for me, some of the stuff I've said will be challenging, but it is about us thinking as a group of OTs across a system, across a local authority, across an area, actually, how do we work so that we provide a much more person-centred way, so that Robert and Agatha don't have to wait unnecessarily on a social care waiting list, when actually, if we just tweaked things differently, that we could actually ensure that Robert and Agatha get those adaptations in quickly, and we can achieve what the government wants to achieve through that white paper and the use of adaptations and equipment to keep people safe and independent for longer. I appreciate that many of you here this afternoon are probably practitioners, and you're probably going to think, well, actually, a lot of this is way above my pay scale. Actually, a lot of this I don't have any control over. At Foundations, we do truly believe that we are all leaders. So even if you are a lowly occupational therapist who's a year out of uni, and you probably feel that you're not a leader, you are a leader. You can influence change. You can, you know, kind of support commissioners, your senior leadership, to understand there is a better way of doing it that actually would improve outcomes in terms of the outcome for the person, and also probably from a resource and sustainability point of view, probably make your systems much more resilient. And better use of your workforce. So we're all leaders, but we've all got to grasp the nettle and look at these as opportunities to make a real difference as occupational therapists. So that's all I've got. I think there are some bits and pieces. I'm trying to just let me just go through. I think Dan has been putting some bits and pieces. West Sussex, no longer seen as older person. So I think it's Dan. I think there's a couple of questions. I'm really sorry, Kelly. It doesn't look like you've been able to access the chat unless Dan did sort that out. So I do. Oh, it's up and working now. So what I'll do is a huge thank you. If I've triggered any thoughts, if we've got any managers, commissioners in the room who want to do things differently, then please contact us at Foundations. If you go to our website and About Us, if you scroll down, you'll see the regional advisors there. Please contact us, because even if it's just an informal chat, we want to chat to you about how we can help and support you. So I hope this special webinar for OT Week has been insightful, thought-provoking. As I say, for those who have registered and I've got your email, I will either today or tomorrow, I'll send you out a copy of the presentation alongside with a couple of links that I've mentioned. So it's just finally for me to say a huge thank you, and please get in contact if there's anything that we can do to support you here at Foundations. And enjoy the rest of OT Week.